So every once in a while, I like to get a video using an older game console, and I like to use these videos to illustrate a point. Sometimes it's about if a game ran more optimally on original hardware, or the original versions of a game, or what we had to deal with back in the day, whatever the case may be. Sometimes I just like to get a quick video off of something like this, but that gets increasingly hard. This is what I've been using for the longest time to record my PlayStation stuff. Now, this particular device uses S-Video or composite, and it's worked fine, well enough anyway, but there's always been one major problem. This particular console is the only one that I have that's modded, and therefore the only one that I have that'll actually play European or Japanese ROMs. And I do have a couple of those that sometimes I like to show. But using this, well, this particular USB head is only designed for NTSC, and these standards, composite and S-Video, they're inventions of the United States of America, not necessarily something that was ever used in Europe. See, during the time that we were using S-Video, they were using SCART, and SCART is nowhere to be found on North American televisions. Instead, we came up with something even more bizarre. This is a component video cable set. Red, green, and blue, and then red and white for audio. Now, why they used red for audio, I have no idea. If it were up to me, I would have said, okay, no, you can use red, green, and blue for video, but you have to use white and black for audio, because black was never used after this again. The only time it's used now in RCA connectors is as a substitute for white, and sometimes you'll have red and black connectors, but so what component video does differently from SCART is that it's an extension of composite standard. Now, I can't really explain to you how composite video works because it goes way into detail and I have no idea how to animate anything. So the best I could do is I could tell you, look up someone else's video on this subject, because that will give you a more in-depth understanding of what the thing is. These two video cable standards are what I've been using for the overwhelming majority of my time recording video games off of original PlayStation hardware, 1, 2, and 3. After 3, they moved completely to HDMI, and 4 and 5 have been only HDMI. Not the way I would have gone, but then again, I'm not Sony, who invented HDMI. That's a little known fact that they don't really like to talk about, but yeah, they pretty much invented HDMI. They were one of the first charter members of the HDMI cartel. They call it the HDMI forum, I call it the cartel. That's a story for another day. Anyway, so in the modern day, this is a capture card that I use the most. This is the AverMedia GC553G2, otherwise known as the AverMedia 2.1 or Live Gamer 2.1 or something like that. Known for the fact that it has two HDMI 2.1 ports on there, one for in, one for out. Now, the reason that I use this particular one rather than the internal version is because the internal version is literally the same as this. It's just built into a PCIe interface. The same data limitations apply to that one as this one. So now you might be saying, Elliot, really? You're using a state-of-the-art HDMI 2.1 capture card, 48 gigabits per second, to record this off of the PlayStation? And yeah, of course I am. In order to explain that, I need to kind of explain my setup down here, and I'm going to do that later on when I talk about surround sound and stuff like that. But I want to make this very clear. These capture cards are not only for HDMI 2.1, that is the limit of what they can record. They can go all the way as far back as HDMI 1.0. So going from here and capturing onto this capture card, that's my top priority. So I need something that can help me facilitate that. Now with my Xbox, I bought the Electron-Shepherd, I think it's called. So for the PlayStation 2, I bought the Electron Pulse. And it just fits right in there. Nice and easy. And it gives me an HDMI port. Unfortunately, it does require an external USB Type-C 5-volt, but that's secondary. Now, the problem with this is it's really not great. So there's actually two problems with it. The first one is it doesn't work with the PlayStation 1. Shocking, I know. Yeah, this is an invention specifically for PlayStation 2. Alright, PS2. So I just plug it in there. And there we go, problem solved, right? Wrong. This is the second problem. I want you to have a look at this. Can you see something wrong with this picture? Yeah, this is anti-stretching. So, what this thing does is it takes its job way too literally. And what it's doing is it's taking a video signal that's however many pixels tall or wide or whatever, converting it to progressive scan, and then sending it down the pipeline. Meanwhile, this thing isn't very smart at all, and it expects the HDMI signal to be clean once it arrives inside the device. This thing, on the other hand, well, it expects the TV to do a bit of hard work. So on pretty much any HDMI monitor that I've tried this on, this looks fine. I cannot complain. I cannot fault this at all. It looks marvelous. But again, only works on the PlayStation 2. Now this thing, on the other hand, is not a television. As much as it says it is, as much as it has an EDID just like any TV does, this is not a television. Now fortunately, I found a real solution, and the solution is this thing. This is the LevelHike RGB HDMI converter. So how does this differ from the other one? Well, it still requires external power, this time in the form of a micro USB, but it does have an HDMI port rather than a cable. I've seen this other one that has a cable attached and it says, oh, true RGB, but I bought it and I went through each individual pin on that one. I'll show you the Amazon listing on screen here. I went through that one and no mention in the entire listing that it's just an RCA 3-head to a single 1/8" 4-pole aux, TRRS aux. So, yeah, the thing just did not work. But it's not really that the thing didn't work, it's that it pushed composite video. And if I wanted that, I'd just use this thing. Like, there's no difference. Yeah, okay, it's got an HDMI adapter on the end. But that adapter still requires the same 5 volts that this does, even using the exact same power standard that this does, the micro USB. So the difference between these two being, this one uses component video and USB Type-C for more compatibility today. This one uses RGB video for more compatibility across all PlayStations. Now, there are legitimate reasons why you would pick one over the other. For instance, if you're using a PlayStation 1, use the RGB. No question. Just do it, because this one will not work. If you're using a PlayStation 2, well, the answer becomes a little bit more vague, because one of the things that this thing lacks is a Toslink interface. And some PlayStation 2 games, like my beloved Klonoa Dorta Phantom Isle, have Dolby Surround. So if a PlayStation 2 game says Dolby Pro Logic 2, that's stereo with enhancements. If it says Dolby Digital, like this one does, that's surround sound. And the only way you can get surround sound is by the Toslink out. Great. So neither of these are capable of that. So these will forever be stereo. That's it. It's rather a shame because I'm told that in actuality, it's not really surround sound when it's through Toslink. It's more of stereo with a header, and the channels are kind of encoded in a specific way. Hence Dolby. The other nice thing about this is that it doesn't have that same issue. So if you look right here on the top, it has this 4x3 or 16x9 switch. Now that's very important for one very important reason. It allows you to have a nice widescreen monitor or a more square monitor. And if you set 16x9, it'll fill out the whole thing. Or if you choose 4x3, it'll push black bars and push the image back to where it's supposed to be in the middle. Now, of course, there is a little bit of like overscan and whatnot that you have to worry about. That kind of stuff is just, it's always going to be there. Don't worry about it. Now, the other thing when comparing this capture device to this converter and using an external capture device is this one's designed for North American NTSC television. Okay, that's fantastic. I live in North America. I have NTSC television. In fact, everything that I own, everything in this room is NTSC. But here's the problem with that. Since a lot of PAL stuff never used any of these weird standards, at least not the same way that we did. In fact, PAL was invented to expressly fix the shortcomings of NTSC. Okay, well, yeah, so NTSC is 2997 or 1001/30 frames per second. PAL is a nice even 25. So why couldn't NTSC be a nice even 30? Well, because they screwed up the audio carrier in the first versions, and so they had to screw up the video a little bit to compensate. At least that's my understanding of it. The whole thing is rather ridiculous. But one thing that wasn't screwed up was RGB. And so since RGB is the same no matter where you go in the world, RGB just works. And I'll give you a video example of this. So not too long ago I was playing Driver 2, and I was specifically doing that for the redriver video. Well, this is what I got from the PAL version of Driver 2. And if you're wondering where the color is, look no further than the color red. Now, the color red is rather interesting because it's the first color that gets decoded. So it's getting decoded kind of properly, but it also shows off exactly how PAL works. So NTSC stands for National Television Systems Committee. It doesn't tell you anything about the technology. Composite is a far more accurate definition of what NTSC actually is. PAL, on the other hand, directly correlates to the technology. Phase altering line. So what it does is it flips the phase every scan line. And the reason that this is helpful is because then you can't get the video desynced. The entire signal's going to go out before that happens. So again, yes, it was designed around the shortcomings of NTSC. The Europeans looked at that and they said, that's not good enough. We can do better. And they did. That became the standard across Europe, Great Britain, Australia, many other PAL territories. And it is the way that it is. PAL won that one for obvious reason, and yes, it was for the better. However, the way that they lost is that everything ran at 50 hertz instead of 60. But that gets into something that I'm not even going to bother talking about because it's just not even worth it. You've seen PAL 50, 60 hertz comparisons. PAL is slower, NTSC is faster, NTSC is worse, PAL is better overall. It is the way that it is. But now I wanted to show you exactly what these different color standards look like on a compatible television. This is a Sony broadcast monitor, and it has S-Video, composite, RGB, or component, but it can only take in mono audio. So with that, let's fire up this TV. Let's have a look. Let's have a look at some video signals. So now it's expecting RGB. No, it's not. This is now an RGB, and I'll put a side-by-side comparison to the two. Alright, so RGB, component, S-Video, because this has no effect anymore, and finally, composite. Once again, no effect. And this is how we can prove that either of these two converters, either component or RGB to HDMI, are doing exactly what they say they do, because they change when we change them. And now for a live demonstration test. So now you might remember in my Klonoa 2 review, I gave that game a 9.5 out of 10, only down to the fact that it had that loading screen glitch. Well, now I can actually show you how that works. So I can recreate it using the Electron Pulse, but not the LevelHike RGB. And the reason is because the Pulse drops the sync signal entirely. Now let's have a look at that exact same scene, but on the LevelHike RGB. Beautiful. Right, so after having a play around with my little Sony's 8 inches and this RGBS cable, which I've had for years, and originally I thought was a component plus composite cable for no reason, but knowing that it's RGB now, that makes a lot more sense, although the yellow does double as composite as well. Anyway, back to these two. So originally I was going to say it doesn't really matter which one you get. There are pros and cons to each, but after having done some significant testing, I have come to the conclusion that the LevelHike is way better in comparison. So allow me to just do a little bit of over-explaining. So when I first got the Electron Pulse, I was just looking to connect my PlayStation 2 into my capture card. I didn't really care about a whole lot of stuff, and I figured it's going to be as good as it's going to get. I mean, if you have a look at the Electron X out, I thought Electron knows what they're doing. Okay, so this is going to be good. I could not have been more wrong. This, I don't want to talk down because truthfully, I couldn't make a device like this myself, but this has the same functionality in a smaller package as I've seen countless times, again and again, for cheap component to HDMI converters. This is just smaller on its own board and powered by a USB Type-C. This is just a cheap component to HDMI board in a 3D printed case for the PlayStation 2. That's all it is. And I don't want to say that. I really hate having to say that because I like Electron. With the Electron X out, I was able to get 720p full surround sound out of my original Xbox. And I couldn't even find component cables for that. So, yeah, it was fantastic. So just imagine how much of a letdown this thing is. It shrinks and stretches the video. Yeah, it's not good. And then we enter the LevelHike. Okay, so what does this do that that one doesn't do? Well, it does RGB. And the reason that that's important is because the Electron Pulse was designed around being able to take the progressive scan video and push it over HDMI. That's fantastic. There are a few games in the PlayStation 2 library that are progressive scan. Only a few, though. The overwhelming majority of them are 480i. And that's exactly what this thing targets. So while it may not be the best visual experience, here's the bottom line. That's what was targeted. So with the exception of a few games in the entire library, this thing is pretty much useless. You're not going to get any better video from this than you would from this. And that leads me back into what I was saying about the Sony 8-inch monitor. I can't really see a difference on that monitor anything past composite. Now, composite is the worst standard that there is. You go to S-Video, you go to component, you go to RGBS. You get noticeable improvements from 1 composite to 2 S-Video. And then after that, it's diminishing returns. Now, it's not to say if you have a bigger CRT, then you should be using RGBS. But, of course, that's CRT. And CRT televisions very typically had component, not RGBS. So, no, if I had to choose between the two, the LevelHike or the Electron Pulse, I would choose the LevelHike every single time. It costs less, and it does more. Dark Lord Elliott, we're done here. PlayStation? Is it raining outside? Hold on.
I'm okay, in case you were wondering.